Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give a reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means your gifts are tax deductible. You can go to justandsinner.org and donate there. You can join our Patreon. And we also have all sorts of things that we offer for sale as well, including the books that we publish. You can go to jspublishing.org and check out all of the volumes that we have there, including a lot of republished older volumes and as well as some original works. You can check out the courses that we offer and seminars through the Widener Institute. You can purchase those videos at justandsinner.org as well. Well, today on the program, I'm going to be getting back to a series that I started a little bit ago, which was a discussion related to Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And so this is part 3 of that discussion. Now, I initially did 2 parts. The second one just didn't get as many views and listens as I usually get, so I wasn't sure if I should go back and do a part 3 because I didn't know if anybody would be interested. But there are quite a few people who watched the second or listened to the second and first and said they really wanted a final exploration of this topic. I think it's really key. It's really essential. These things are, maybe the most relatable of all and important of almost anything that I do, because they really address how it is that we think as a culture and how we approach basically anything as a culture. So if you haven't listened to the first 2 programs or watched the first 2, I would recommend you do that before you jump into this one. And on this, we are going to be discussing, hopefully this will be the final part, because there's one thing that I really didn't get to in that book. Now, the final thing that I wanted to talk about was the kind of 3-step process that leads to where our culture is today. And we've talked about a lot of background. We've talked about a lot of philosophical background. We've talked about religious shifts and all sorts of things. But within his book, Carl Trueman makes the argument that there are basically 3 things that have to happen that change culture to be what it is today. The first is the psychologizing of the self. We've had this discussion about expressive individualism being the kind of definitive way in which we view the world and view ourselves, so that we see ourselves as primarily autonomous individuals, and we have to show off that individuality in our self-expression. So there is a high value on self-expression and showing forth your authentic self. The second is that psychology becomes sexualized. And so you see this with Sigmund Freud, not just Freud, but others as well. So now with this focus on inward identity and psychological identity, kind of constituting the core of who you are as a person, that then becomes sexualized, which means that at that point, the core of who you are is who you are in terms of your internal sexual desires, which is why today people speak about identity in terms of sexuality. This is very common in our culture today. And the third part is that sex becomes politicized. Sex becomes politicized. And, in our world today, everything is politicized. Absolutely everything. I mean, as I'm recording this, I know it's going to be uploaded a bit after this, but as I'm recording this, Burger King just made the announcement that they're donating the profits to their chicken sandwich to LGBTQ activist groups, because now we have to politicize which chicken sandwich you buy, and if you get Chick-fil-A, you're supporting a certain ideology, and if you buy a Burger King chicken sandwich, you're supporting a certain ideology, which is, just the amount of politicization in every field of life right now is something that's pretty unprecedented. So with that, we're going to delve into each of these 3 steps. So we're going to ask, what do we mean by the psychologizing of the self? How did this occur? We're going to kind of boil that down, broad strokes, broad overview. Then we're going to talk about how the self became sexualized, and then we can talk about the third aspect of that, which is how sex then became politicized. So let's start with the first of those, the psychologizing of the self. If you read something that's interesting, if you read classic literature, and by classic I mean ancient Greek and Roman classics. If you read things from the classical era, one thing that you quickly notice if you read Homer or whatever else it might be, Virgil, Sophocles, whatever, one thing that you notice is in the writing, there is not a lot of emphasis on one's personal feelings. Now, if you read a novel today, one of the things that you get in a novel that you don't get, say, in a movie in the same way, is that you get a kind of inward look into people's thoughts. And you look at their motivations, and these things are interesting. I'm saying that they make for good stories. So I'm not criticizing that or saying that we shouldn't do that. But it's something that I think is striking. When I started spending more time reading classical literature from the classical era, it just became very apparent. When you read something from, say, the 19th century and you read something from the first century, it becomes very obvious that there's a shift in the way that people are thinking. Because when you look at things that are ancient, you look at outward interactions, you look at how they interact with others, their place in society. And as time goes on, that gradually becomes more inward focused, just on the way we think about ourselves, on the questions that we have. We want to know people's motivations. We want to know what's going on inwardly with those individuals. We like those kind of stories. But that's not really what was prized so much in the ancient world in the same way. Now, when I say that, I want to make it clear that this is not to say that there is no such thing as the concept of like an inner life in the ancient world. And this is something that I find as kind of maybe overreaction to individualism, is this idea that, well, ancient society had no concept of the individual, and there was no such thing as being introspective in the ancient world. And there was no such thing as this kind of inward looking like at all. And then you have these really bizarre theories. If you want to go down a weird rabbit hole, look up the bicameral mind on Wikipedia or something at some point. But there are these people that believe that in the past the ancients actually heard voices that they thought were the gods, and it was really their inner voice, and that's kind of the reason why this shifted. I don't buy the theory, but it's interesting, and it does just show that the theory comes from something that is real. It comes from this clear shift from this dialogue that is external, either to people or people to God or the gods, that then becomes inward monologue throughout the years. So, but I want to say, it's not like this inward psychologizing or this interior looking just didn't exist in the ancient world. I think that is very mistaken. You see this in New Testament scholarship when you look at debates surrounding Romans 7, where Paul speaks about his own struggle with sin. And in a lot of commentaries and in a lot of debates surrounding that passage, the argument is made that this is not Paul talking about his inward state, because that's like a later thing that would happen. He's really using the self to talk about this kind of corporate thing, which is Israel's relationship to the law. Now, I have a whole podcast that I've done on Romans 7 if you want to see my arguments related to that topic and why I think Paul's talking about his present Christian experience. But I think some of that comes from a kind of misunderstanding that there's like no inner life. So if you look at something like St. Augustine's Confessions, this is kind of the great example. And here you're talking Augustine, who's writing at the very end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century. And in his Confessions, it's a very introspective kind of book in that he is describing things like his affections or his inner desires or his inner motivations. And in that, it's not like Augustine is coming out of nowhere, because when you look at the philosophers, you read Plato and you read Aristotle, they do talk about the inward motivations and things like the inward thoughts and desires, and they explain that, especially in light of things like virtue and even how we grow in knowledge. Augustine kind of shifts the conversation a little bit, because Augustine adds this extra element of affection that's really key for him. What are the desires of the heart? What are the affections that the individual has? So it's not that there is no interior self at all, or there is no concept of the individual. And I think that is just so key when you see something like Christer Stendahl, who wrote his article, Paul and the Introspective Conscience in the West, which makes the argument that there's no such thing as introspective conscience really until Augustine to some extent, but then not really also until Luther. Like it gets kind of amplified by Luther. So that all needs to be made clear, because what I'm not saying is that there was no inner psychological sense of self. What happens, though, is that the inner psychological self ends up becoming prioritized and emphasized in a way that it never had before. That one's identity becomes entwined most intimately with what you are personally and individually feeling and thinking at the expense of your place in society. So in the ancient world, one's identity was largely formed by one's position in society. And that could be religious, it could be economic, it could just be in terms of your role in the community, your job, your place in your family, whatever it might be. But that constitutes your identity. It doesn't mean that the inner self is no part of your identity, but by no means is that the most important thing or the central thing. And those two things are, kind of go with one another, right? They fit together. And it's understood that if your inner desires are not good or are not aligned with who you are or should be according to society, the problem is not with society necessarily. Not that there's no such thing as societal critique, because there is. But you're going to ask, well, maybe is it my desires that are the problem, right? Maybe my desires and my inner state should be conformed to that which is external to me. Whereas the go-to today is the reverse of that, right? The go-to today is, well, I'm right, society's wrong. And that's just not the case in the ancient world. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what results in this psychologizing of the self, this shift to inwardness and inner desire and inner feeling here in the modern world. So, first we've got the background there that says it's not that this never existed before at all, but it becomes prioritized in a way that it hadn't been before. So the story in some way starts, like almost anything else, with, well, really Descartes. We're talking at the beginning of the modern era. René Descartes is seen as the father of modern philosophy. And Descartes' philosophy, and I've discussed this in other places before, so I don't want to get too into Descartes particularly, but one thing I will mention is that Descartes, as he starts his philosophy, is starting with the inner experience of the self. So philosophy, if you look at what's going on in philosophy prior to Descartes, it is philosophy as a discipline is generally about the common good, right? It's about what is good for society, what is good for the self, who God is, who man is, but it's all with this kind of unified vision with a desire for conformity to the good or God, which means, your understanding of beauty and your knowledge and your moral or virtuous life, all of that is to be conformed to this external thing, source, which is God. And with Descartes, this all shifts. So this is reversed from this, external looking toward the good into the self. And Descartes begins his philosophy from a perspective of skepticism and asks the question, how do I know anything at all? We have the very famous cogito, I think, therefore I am. So this is the beginning of Descartes' philosophy. So philosophy then starts, or knowledge starts, with knowledge of the self and one's internal experience. Now, Descartes doesn't then, from there, deny that the external world exists or anything. He goes on to say that it does, and he's got his way of doing it. I don't think Descartes' argument's very good, but he certainly thinks it's convincing for whatever that's worth. So we see this shift, right, from looking outward toward God to now starting with the self. Well, this is probably most importantly developed, especially within a Western American context, which is where I am. So this is what I'm thinking of, is with the development of liberalism, with the ideology of liberalism, political liberalism and philosophical liberalism. The kind of founding figure for liberalism, and it's not like this comes out of a vacuum either. We could trace this back and say, where is he getting this from? But oftentimes, the one who's said to be kind of the founding figure of liberalism as a movement is Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes' years are from 1588 to 1679. So he's kind of a contemporary of people like Johann Gerhard and these early Lutheran scholastic thinkers. So Hobbes writes his very famous book, Leviathan. If you've read Leviathan, it's not an easy read. It's a giant book. It's very large. And in Hobbes' Leviathan, he makes a number of arguments. But the one thing that I think is really key and really essential to seeing this kind of individualizing or psychologizing of the self is Hobbes describes people in a state of nature. And for Hobbes, this natural state of man is not a good one. In other words, he's in a kind of an agreement with the idea of original sin in some way, that people are not by nature good. They're in a state of competition and fighting, and really it's unsustainable. But for Hobbes, what's really important is that humans are by nature individual, free, and autonomous beings. That we are by nature like individual subjective selves. That is the essence of who we are. And Hobbes argues that there is social order, but that social order goes against the state of nature, and the function and purpose of the social order is to bring us out of that state of nature into something else. Like it's imposed on from the outside. So government is this then kind of Leviathan, as the name suggests, that kind of has to put a stop or put limits on those autonomous individuals so that the state of nature to some degree is curbed so that they can get along to some degree. And just so society can function, because people can't function just as autonomous individual selves or they'll destroy each other. So we have to have then some kind of agreement or contract with one another. And we'll talk about that idea of social contract. But what's key here in looking at Hobbes is the social order is not necessarily part of who we are and who we are created to be. The social order is not itself good. The social order is something that is imposed from the outside. And so what happens is there's this opposition between who we really are authentically and then the social order that imposes itself upon us. So that differs very heavily from a Christian perspective, which says that there is in fact order within creation itself. If you look at the creation account in the beginning of Genesis, there is order within nature. There is order within, there are particular realms that God creates as distinct from one another. He creates specific objects or animals or creatures to go within each of those realms. Everything is made according to its kind, as Genesis says. Then there is the creation of man as male and female, as distinct, but each having their own unique roles. They live for a particular purpose within creation, which is that they are to do things like, name the animals. They are to, have dominion over the earth. They are to create children. They are also to live in a kind of order under God. So, there is order within creation. Now, I would say that government, in its fullest sense that we think about it today, and there are different ways to talk about this too. The question of, would government exist without the fall? Well, it depends what you mean. Would there be social order without the fall? Yes, absolutely. But would there be a need for a government that would punish people for wrongdoing before the fall? Of course not, because there wouldn't be wrongdoing, So kind of the answer I give to that question is a bit of a yes and no. But what we don't want to do is go the way of Hobbes and just say, social order is purely imposed from the outside, because then it's against who we really are as these kind of free, autonomous individuals. So this then, leads to what we call social contract theory. And John Locke is going to be another major figure with his treatises on government. And this is going to lead to the system of government that we have in the United States. But social contract theory essentially says that government itself is not something that is divinely ordered, but government is basically consistent. It consists in a kind of social contract between various individuals. So the idea is that we as humans are naturally autonomous, free creatures. And as these free, autonomous creatures, we contract together. We make an agreement with one another that we are going to give up certain freedoms so that we can preserve other freedoms, so that we can freely act as individuals in as many ways as possible, while also giving up some freedoms for the necessity of a common good. So we make this contract because my liberty could, be damaged by someone else who in their liberty decides that they think it'd be fun to kill me, or whatever they want to do that would harm me or take my property. So that means that government exists essentially for the protecting of liberty of individuals. Now, this shifts away from a classical Christian understanding of government, not just Christian, but classical, just, I wouldn't even say just Western, this is just a classical understanding, East and West, is that the government is not independent. It doesn't have this just autonomy. It doesn't have this creation in and of itself, but it serves to preserve society in light of this social order or religious order or divine order, really, behind it. So whether that is, you have a pantheon of gods and the emperor is part of that pantheon somehow, as like in ancient Rome, or you have in Christianity the understanding that God himself is the one who sets up government. God himself is in charge of government, and God establishes people there. So then the order comes from God to the world. Now, with liberalism, the order is actually created by us as autonomous individuals to preserve our autonomous individuality. That's the function and purpose of government. It starts with us and it ends with us in our freedom. So I have a lot more to say about that. I have a section on this in the book I'm currently writing on truth, goodness, and beauty. So maybe I'll leave it there. There's plenty more I could say, but I'll make you buy the book. I'm sure I'll talk more about this on the podcast as time gets closer to the release of that too. All right, so this idea that you find in Hobbes that the state of nature is a bad one, that is not universally adopted, right? So for Hobbes, the state of nature is one of like violence and death. Others start to argue that, well, the state of nature is actually us at our best. Like if we are just who we are according to nature, we are really at our best. And social institutions, including government, really are at odds with who we are. They stop us from being who we truly and authentically are. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a key figure for this. He's a figure that Trueman uses a lot, and Trueman spends a bit of time on Rousseau. And I think rightly so. He's a key figure. There are so many other figures that he could focus on. Any treatment like this is necessarily going to be limited in who you choose to grab onto. So Rousseau becomes a figurehead. It's not only Rousseau, but in Trueman's work, he becomes kind of an example of what then shifts. So Rousseau, and his years are 1712 to 1778. For Rousseau, the authentic self is to be found apart from societal imposition. So essentially, the authentic self is the state of nature. We are good in that state of nature. And this government, social structure, all of that is at odds with who we truly are. And it imposes order from the outside and it oppresses us. So we can't really be who we are authentically. Our authentic self is kind of being squeezed out. It's not allowed to breathe because of all the constraints of the culture and world around us. So this is this idea of a kind of authentic self. Now, the notion of authentic self is going to be key as it develops in, say, existentialism. So my study is more than in Rousseau, who I've read a little bit of, but I focused a bit more on the existentialist movement and Martin Heidegger, who is not quite an existentialist in his own understanding anyway, but really he's part of that whole movement. But Heidegger in the 20th century grabs onto this notion of the authentic self and then the inauthentic self, which is similar to what Rousseau was getting at here. So this is why I say it's beyond just Rousseau, and it's beyond just the 18th century. This is a multi-century process that people are talking about this kind of stuff. So for example, Heidegger talks about a life that is lived in inauthenticity. And an inauthentic life is a life where you just kind of do what you're expected to do. It's like your family, owns a business. It's the expectation that you take over the business. When you get to a certain age, it's the expectation that you get married to someone in the community, at say 20 years old or around there. And then you have kids and all of that stuff. And the inauthentic existence is when the individual just kind of does what they're expected to do. So if you take over the family business, get married when you're supposed to, have kids, live in a nice house in the suburbs, that's inauthentic life. You're not being the true self because you're not thinking about what you're doing. You're not doing it out of passion. And so for Heidegger, you discover the authentic self when you kind of recognize that and you recognize that you are just part of this broader machine, right? You're just doing what you're supposed to do without thinking. It's just kind of what you're doing. And then you stop back and then you consider that, and now you're able to actually make a free decision, right? Now you make a decision to be your authentic self. You can look at what the options are and then choose to do what you want to do, or really choose to be who you want to be. And this is part of what Jean-Paul Sartre refers to as the dictum that existence precedes essence, which means that what you are is determined by who you are. So you decide existentially, you decide who you're going to be. You make a free decision, and the essence of who you are is then created by the self. So you create who you are, rather than you being something or having an essence and then living out of that essence, living out who you are. So this is reversed. So this idea that you find in Rousseau develops in existentialism, and it develops all over the place. There are plenty of other places to see it as well. So Rousseau talks about the state of man, and he views man like at the beginning as a kind of a brute beast, and at the very beginning of human development, we're kind of just like animals, and that's not good. But he says, well, to live like an animal is not good, but also to live in civilized society as we're in today is also not good, because the first we're just acting on animal instinct, and in the later we now have no authenticity at all, because we're kind of oppressed by all of these social systems. So Rousseau then develops this idea of the savage. Now, it's said that the idea of a noble savage really starts with Rousseau, so that the self is best, the human self is best in this kind of intermediate period between the animals and then civilized society. So in the time of a kind of savage, you're one with nature, you don't have all of these annoying social constraints, and you can just kind of be who you are, be one with creation. And you see this all over the place. I mean, you see this with people who think like, oh, I need to go, find myself and be my true authentic self, and I can do that by living a hippie life and eating just organic food on an organic farm and ignoring all society, so I can really be my true self. Or I have to go off on a voyage by myself, a voyage of like self-discovery away from the constraints of the world. For example, I think this would be interesting to dive into, because I think this is a really actually key part of where we are today, but the beat poets. If you read someone like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, it's kind of a great example of this like idealized, oh, I can be my true self as I just go off on the road, explore and do what I feel like doing. And yeah, I've read On the Road, and it's, I don't know, it's what it is. It's better than Naked Lunch, I guess. That was a far worse book, and I don't recommend anyone reading that. But if you see that movement, I think it really gives a great picture of that idea. Or like watch The Dead Poet Society. The Dead Poet Society is like the movie that everybody who like thinks they're like artsy or thinks that they've discovered something profound watches when you're young and you're a teenager, and then hopefully you mature and realize that that's a stupid movie. But sorry, but the kind of like ideology behind that, and the like beauty of just being yourself and rebelling against the rules and doing what, like, it's this romanticized idea that really does stem from this false conception that's in someone like Rousseau, that what is really truly beautiful is to be apart from society and be different and be whoever you want to be and whoever you are, and that will better come out when you go against whatever societal norms there are. So yeah, I know I have I avoid giving some of my stances on pop culture things, but I can do that and probably annoy all of you. Okay. So then you also, one other thing about him Rousseau that I was going to bring up is that he rejects the doctrine of original sin. He's very purposefully against Augustine, against the Augustinian notions of original sin, because it's directly in the face of what he's saying. I mean, for Augustine, original sin is that our affections are naturally drawn inward because we're sinners, incurvatus, curved in on the self. We become very selfish. For Rousseau, we kind of become selfish because of the competitive nature of what society forces us to do. But that's not who we really would be if it was just up to us. Augustine says exactly the opposite. that, and then we do have law in society, but you have to have a common good in society. We have to have law and structure because we have to be forced to go outside of ourselves because we never would otherwise. Like, this is why, marriage, for example, is an institution that helps the development of the self, because you get married and guess what? You're forced to do something, to think about someone else other than yourself. But now the way we view marriage is, well, I'm supposed to think first of myself, and then I think most of myself and do my own thing and have my own life, because I could never, of course, compromise on like a job for the sake of someone else. That would be insane. And the other person does the same thing. So we have these like two individual lives and we do what we want to do, but then try to force a marriage to work under the assumption that I can be as selfish as I want, and we can have these two very, very selfish, expressive individuals coming together and we can make it work, and it doesn't work. Because the purpose of social institutions largely is to curb what is that inherent selfish inclination, and that incurvatus se, that being curved in on ourselves and being selfish. So marriage forces us out of that. And having kids is the same way. And now, having kids is seen as oppressive, and it could ruin your life if you have kids. And, it stops you from making your free individual choices, because what's important is the inner self and your desires and whatever you feel like your ambitions in life are. But having kids forces you to look at someone else. And is it always fun and always the most pleasurable thing? No, of course it's going to stop you from doing what you want to do all the time. You're not as free when you have kids to make whatever decisions, to do whatever you want, whenever you want. But it's good for you, because discipline is good. So the idea of the authentic self is opposed to all of these structures, which is why ultimately the goal of a lot of progressive movements has always been the destruction of the family. Because the family is the foundational institution. I'm not saying it to be like fearmonger extreme, like they say this. This is, I can demonstrate from the literature of the different waves of feminism, for example, that the destruction of the family has been the ultimate goal. It just is. That shouldn't be a controversial statement, but I know people say that's not true. It is. I mean, they say this. Okay, so let's see. Let's move on then to what's going on in the church, because I think this is key to this individualizing of the self, or the creation of the introspective self, is some things that are happening in the church. Now, through Romanticism, and Romanticism is the broader movement that Rousseau is a part of, a movement that emphasizes personal feeling and beauty, but beauty in the sense of like how we connect with beauty, not beauty in the sense of God being an objective standard of beauty. So Romanticism is something that grows out of this time, and the church has to respond. There are a lot of reasons for Romanticism growing at this time. I think my fundamental thesis in the book that I'm writing is that truth, goodness, and beauty in the Enlightenment era, and we can see the precursor of this with nominalism, but in the Enlightenment era, truth, goodness, and beauty were divorced from one another. That fundamental divorce of truth, goodness, and beauty, that they are no longer one consistent thing, which is a common good, that is the true, the good, and the beautiful that we all as a society are aimed at. What the Enlightenment does, especially with rationalism, is tries to say, well, truth is objective to some extent, depending on who you are or what that means, because you can't really say that about someone like Hume or Kant, really. But then goodness and beauty are subjective and truth is objective. Well, it falls apart. We are not creatures that are created to be just mere scientific machines who just study the processes of the natural world in any objective sense. It's not who we are. It's never going to be who we are. This is exactly why the new atheism doesn't exist anymore. Like, it was the big thing in 2005. Everybody was an atheist. And guess what everybody is now? They're pagans. Like, everyone's a pagan, because and they're all like more morally angry about whatever they stand for as what they feel is good and right than like ever before, because we can't do that. Like, you can't logically function as this like scientific, I am just looking at facts kind of machine. You can't do it. We are created with desires. We have delights. We are looking for those delights and desires. If they're not aimed towards the good, God, they're going to be aimed towards something. You can't suppress them or get rid of them. You're not a Vulcan. You can try to be. It's not going to work. Kulinar is not a real thing. Okay, so with all of that being said, in the Enlightenment, you have this reaction against rationalism, because we are created to have like desires and affections and all these things. That's what creates Romanticism. So Romanticism grows out of that. Now, Romanticism doesn't get to a point of saying that beauty is objective, but it focuses on this affection and beauty and desire because that's just a natural part of who we are. We need that. So that's what Romanticism ends up doing. Now, this affects the church. So what does the church do in response to rationalism? Well, you do have growth in pietism. Pietism becomes more inward focused than before. It becomes more or less kind of intellectually rigorous. I think the earlier pietists were very different in that way. You see that there is an emphasis on things like personal conversion. So let's take a couple figures just to give an example of this. The first is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Speeches on Religion to its Culture Despisers, 1799. Friedrich Schleiermacher is the father of Protestant liberalism. And in that, and then in The Christian Faith as well later, he develops a new way of looking at Christianity, where Christianity is essentially just placed within that romantic mindset. It's placed within that romantic framework, which says that religion is a feeling, he says. It's a feeling of absolute dependence. Now, feeling for Schleiermacher, if you read some scholars on Schleiermacher, they're all going to point out that feeling is not quite what we think of as feeling, because we may think like, oh, he's saying like we have you go to a worship service and hear some songs and like feel something, and that's all God is. It's more than that. It's more of an orientation, but it is ultimately about something that is inner, and it's about your affections. And things like the objective reality of things like the Trinity, like that's not important for Schleiermacher. So religion is then identified with that which affects the inward self. It's not about something external or who God himself is or what he's done for us. It's about how I personally connect with God through faith or through this feeling of absolute dependence. So you find that within Protestant liberalism. But it's not like it's only a problem that affects Protestant liberalism. Now, if you look at, for example, the Great Awakening of the 18th century, what happens in religion generally, in Christianity, is that there is an increased emphasis on the necessity of personal conversion. And there is a decreased emphasis on things like church structure, church authority, the sacraments, the external means of grace. Because as people are now thinking so much about their inward subjective states, just in the broader culture, the church starts doing that too. And conversion now is taken away from the objective thing that is the church, because remember that's like external, that's society, that can be opposed to something that is real and authentic. And the real and authentic self is who you are in your heart. So to really know if you're a real authentic Christian, you don't look to things like the sacraments. You don't look to the organization of the church. Instead, now you are looking to the inward self. You're looking to your inward desires and what's going on inside of you. So this leads to then a focus on Christianity that is defined by an individual conversion experience. So that now the way that I become a Christian is not through the sacrament of baptism, but the way that I become a Christian is by having an inward experience that changes me internally. So again, everything is turning inward. We're going inward again and again and again. So the church then is really formative in some ways for the Western conception of expressive individualism. The church both adopts it from the outside, but also is one of the catalysts for emphasizing it. Where the church itself is one of the catalysts for emphasizing this total internality, this subjectivizing of who we are. And so who I am as a Christian is now not defined by God's word proclaimed to me. It's not defined by God's means of grace given to me. My Christianity, my Christian identity, is defined by my own subjective internal experience. And so this is why, in Lutheranism, for example, the 17th century is like the great era of theology for Lutheranism. I'd say the 19th century too is another really great era for the development of theology within Lutheranism. And you've got so much great dogmatic work and so much great liturgical work and hymnody and all of this stuff going on. But then in the 18th century, things really change. You don't have these great dogmatic works anymore. You have a couple, it's not like nobody's doing it anymore. But the focus then becomes on a lot of publications that describe conversions. They're compilations of personal conversions, deathbed conversions, and conversions of prisoners and these kinds of things. Now, first of all, I don't want to say that like stories of conversion or anything personal is bad. I think that's good. And I think it's encouraging for us to hear how God has worked in these ways. But the problem is that the conversion experience, the internality, then comes to replace or take the place of the external means of grace. So that happens within the Lutheran Church. In the Reformed Church, you get what becomes the Great Awakening, the Jonathan Edwards types, where this personal conversion becomes central. You doubt whether anybody's really saved because the salvation that someone has is really dependent on what kind of experience they have. Then you get, of course, the popularizing of credo baptism, meaning believer's baptism, because now the more important thing is not that God's means of grace come to me, because that would be this whole oppressive social order thing. Instead, what's important is that I have the right feelings. I inwardly am in the right state. So the baptism then, that's not as important. It's not as important that God is doing something, but what's important is whether I personally have the right identity, and then the baptism follows that as an expression of my own individual identity internally. That's what happens there within Baptist churches. And that's why credo baptism becomes the default mode within American evangelicalism after that, which is based on expressive individualism in so many ways. So that's what happens in Christianity as well. So it comes from all of these different directions, this inwardness, psychologizing of the self. Then you have things like the Transcendentalist movement, for example, in the 1820s and 1830s. I would say kind of the Beats and the Existentialists also follow this in the following century. The Transcendentalists saying people are basically good when they act on their own. Institutions are corrupt. They lead to bad deeds or bad actions. We should really trust not institutions, but internal intuition. People are best when they're self-reliant, reliant on self and not reliant on others. Like the exact opposite of what Scripture tells us. So that's the first stage. And that's really key to the entirety of Trueman's argument. And that's really key to the entirety of everything leading to where we are today. So from there, right, we have the psychologizing of the self. We're turned continually inwards in terms of identity. But then the question then is like, how does sex get involved in all of this? Because that's not really where those figures are coming from. And so like what happens because before it's like your religious conversion, your religious experience defines who you are. This is why Mormonism, by the way, like arises in the 19th century. Mormonism is such a great example of this ideology because it's all about the personal testimony, right? You have to have the right feelings. You have to have the testimony that the Book of Mormon is true. It's such an American religion. It's such a profoundly individualistic religion that it just encapsulates this ideology and these developments, I think, so well. So then you have the inward self, right? You're not defined anymore now by like a personal religious conversion. Now it's like your sexuality defines you. Like, who are you sexually attracted to? Or not, it's not just who, but like what are your kinks or weird stuff. I mean, it gets bizarre. But this identifies who you are now. So what in the world happened? How did we get from point A to point B? And so there's a lot that happens here. Essentially, I could just name two names to say, hey, here's the story. It's Freud and Kinsey. Sigmund Freud and Alfred Kinsey really are the two main figures here. They're not the only ones. There are plenty of others as well. But I think if you want to boil it down to any two figures that really have defined our modern approach to sexuality and the conflation of sex with identity, it would be those two. I think de Beauvoir would be a big part of this as well, and especially with her connections with Sartre and existentialism, because those two things overlap a lot. But I'll say Freud and Kinsey are the two main figures. Well, Freud. Okay, Sigmund Freud. You've all heard of Sigmund Freud, I'm sure. As many of you probably know, I'm a huge fan of the show Frasier. I watch it. It's like the only show I watch anymore. But the main character Frasier is he's a Freudian psychologist, and they make jokes about it all the time. And of course, like Freud is discounted. Like nobody believes Freud's theories. They're wacky and nuts. Okay, so in many ways, and he was brilliant. Like he's a really interesting guy to read. If you read Freud, he's fascinating. He's a good read. I have a volume of Freud just up there, actually. I was going to start reading it soon to delve into some of his works. But what I have read, it's very interesting and discredited psychologically, but he does lay some groundwork which is really key, because Freud sexualizes everything, like everything. And so Freud is the first one who comes up with this notion of the libido, which is like something that we all know about and people talk about. Okay. But he sees this as this kind of internal drive for sex, just like we have hunger, just like we have desires for other things. And like that in and of itself, okay, I mean, all the philosophers have talked about this. But what is important about this idea in Freud is that he sees this as connected with people in their childhood. And this is pretty like twisted in a lot of ways. And what happens is, and I think we're seeing this now, because as you watch things on TV, and I'm recording this during June, and people know what month June is these days. But you watch some of the things that are on kids' TV shows, and I can't let my kids watch anything on TV like ever, because you just don't know what kind of garbage is going to show up. But there's stuff that is very like sexually charged that kids are seeing, and it's not. And by that I don't just mean things of orientation, but just sexually charged stuff. That really is not even just an appropriate discussion to have for kids, and it's brought down to like a kid level. Things that have to do with like kinks and weird just stuff that is totally inappropriate for kids. Anyway, in some ways this should not be surprising to us that this happens, because it's an inevitable result of where we start with Freud and then where we go with Kinsey as well. So within the sexualizing of self, this really starts with the sexualization of childhood, because the libido is active in childhood for Freud and for Kinsey as well. So we've got, and this is, very famous. He talks about the stages, and there are other stages added after as well. But there's the oral stage, right, with the fixation on the mouth where you're breastfeeding. Now all of a sudden that's like sexualized. We have the anal stage, which is like when you're, your bowel movements, you're fixated on your anus as a toddler. Then we have the phallic stage from ages 3 to 6. Freud identifies this. So this means that we can divide childhood up into sexual internal desires and drives that are there in the child, which is nuts. To be frank, it's nuts. So, and I always wonder, like, how twisted was Freud, like, to come up with these ideas? He was brilliant, like, no doubt about it, but there's got to be some weird stuff in his own inner psychology there. Jung is the much better psychologist in many ways, and also a very interesting thinker. Jung, I think there's a lot more good that can be found in Jung than Freud, as brilliant as Freud was. But so he has this. There are all sorts of ideas that develop in Freud. I know I'm really skimming over this. There's so much that could be said here, but he develops this idea of the unconscious. We have these unconscious desires and thoughts that really drive a lot of what we do. And so a lot of that unconscious comes from these sexual desires. So a lot of our actions are defined sexually. And he would also say that things that don't develop properly within these various early sexual stages in life then result in these personality or character traits later in life. Which means that now, when I look at character traits, when I look at things that are bad in my life, when I'm dealing with trauma or whatever, all of it ultimately goes back to some kind of sexual desire or mishandling of something that is sexual. So, and we have ideas that are, things are repressed. He gets this idea that, every, young boy wants to have sex with their own mother and kill their father, which, based on the great Sophocles play, which is, really wonderful work, Oedipus. So the Oedipus complex, as we know. I actually read the 2 plays about Oedipus from Sophocles just a few months ago, and they're really good. I really recommend them. Really, interesting stuff. So, but that's where the name comes from. Not quite the same as the story. I think it's, not quite what the point of the story was. But the point is, all of the issues or aspects of your identity now are boiled down to sexual desires or things that have gone wrong sexually or things that have been messed up in one way or another. So that determines like who we are. So our identity now is all of a sudden defined by sexuality. And that is not something that's ever happened before. Not that I'm aware of. It is true that, for example, homosexual acts were common in, say, ancient Greece. Like, of course, read Plato, read some of the dialogues. It's talked about, even with young boys too. And it's, yeah. But it's a reality. It's not like anyone says, oh, homosexuality didn't exist before. It existed in the Roman world as well. There are even kind of marriages between men that are talked about in ancient Rome. And there are some things like that have happened in the past. So especially male homosexuality is very well known in the ancient world. It is definitely something that exists. Like, there's no doubt about it. What changes, though, is now that becomes identity. It becomes who you are. And that was never the case before. Those were things that you did. Now it is exactly who you are. So that means that the whole conversation surrounding sexuality has totally shifted, because it's not a discussion about things that are done or some desires you may have or whatever, but now it's a discussion about who you are at your uttermost, like the heart of who you are. Your essence is your sexuality. And that means that what we're left with as a society is a place where you can't even have like a conversation about what acts are okay and which aren't, or if anything is off limits, like anything at all. Because if you do that, you're attacking someone's identity. You're going after who they are. You're saying you're not a person. You're not valuable. It's all very, very personal. And that occurs because of the way we have shifted identity to sexuality, and that begins with Freud. So after Freud, we have Alfred Kinsey. And Kinsey is from 1894 to 1956. Kinsey writes what are what are known as the Kinsey reports. He has one on male sexuality and then female sexuality. The story of Kinsey is so bizarre and weird. He is the first major figure in the field that's called sexology, which still exists. Kinsey, there's the Kinsey Institute or whatever it is, Kinsey Foundation. I don't know. There are all sorts of things named after the guy. He's revered and honored as this wonderful figure, but he was a pretty twisted dude. And so what Kinsey does in these Kinsey reports, he does these surveys, and in these surveys, he's asking people about sex. He largely takes his information from prisoners, which is weird and does not give like a normal view of like people's sexuality. It's a very particular part of the population. Everybody recognizes this now. Like, yeah, the studies were not done very well. Like, even the people who like him, they're going to say, yeah, they weren't done well. The statistics were not great. They like him because he started this field of study and this research that then has been developed in different ways. But largely through, talking with prisoners and others, he comes up with this study of sexuality. One of the famous things that comes out of the Kinsey studies, he says 1 in every 10 men is homosexual. The 1 in 10 statistic was thrown around a lot for many years. It's not right. I mean, we know now that's not accurate. But that was accepted for some time based on Kinsey's studies there. So along with this, what we have is something called the Kinsey scale, where you have the scale from like heterosexual to homosexual. Again, this is all based on the notion that's been developed now that wherever you fall in this scale is your identity. So you find an identity somewhere on this scale, which is this broader spectrum of sexuality. So some people are on this end, some people are on this end, and most people are kind of somewhere, in the middle of this broad spectrum, and that's who you are. So that's so common in rhetoric today, but that starts with Kinsey. So Kinsey's the first one that makes this Kinsey scale. So you're identifying yourself with your sexual desires. There's a scale of sexual desires. Wherever you fall on that scale determines like who you are as a person. And then the most disturbing part of Kinsey and his study is that he speaks very much about the libido that exists in children. He speaks about child orgasms, and he argues, like Freud, that there is, children are essentially sexual beings. And there's a lot of debate about where Kinsey got this information, because he's doing these surveys. So, I know that there are opposing views of where he got certain things from or not, but it's very clear that he spoke with at least some individuals who had done things to children to get information about how the children responded and reacted. And that is at the root of like all study of sex in our culture, is these two figures, Freud and Kinsey, who both sexualized children and both saw sex as a core and key part of our identity. And both of whom, like, their research methods are discredited by like everyone. But the foundation that they laid there is still profoundly with us in our culture today. And we're just seeing the ramifications of that, and it's a hot mess. So, with that, I know I'm almost at an hour here, so I'm not going to be able to get into the politicization of sex. Maybe I'll do a separate program on that if you want me to. I mean, like, everyone kind of knows that part of the story because that's where we are now. However, if you do want me to do that, let me know. I certainly can. I've got plenty of information on that topic, but I don't know. So hopefully you found this helpful. This third part of this series really should cover kind of the major strokes of where we are today. With Trueman's book, as you know, that I'm not just reiterating what's in Trueman's book, I'm adding a lot of things too, and I'm using this kind of as a jumping off point for some other ideas, but this should hopefully give you a broad overview of the basics of what's going on in Trueman's book, and just the overall understanding of where we are as a culture today, and exactly how it is that we got to where we are. So thanks so much for watching and or listening, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.